Spa, Monza, and Indianapolis are the tracks that I think always require a certain amount of attention because of the history and drivers that have raced on it. This is a place, Spa is a place where Dan Gurney won. You know, at 68, I've had plenty of time to think about the people I raced against. The wins, the disappointments, the missed opportunities, they all become part of the same memory after enough years pass. But one question has followed me almost everywhere I've gone since I left Formula One. Eddie, who was the greatest driver you ever raced against? It's a fair question, but I've never thought it was the right one. Greatness is measured by championships, statistics, and history books. Admiration is something much more personal. You don't admire someone simply because they won more races than you did. You admire the drivers who changed the way you looked at this sport. The ones who made you realize that talent could take many different forms. Sometimes it was raw speed, sometimes it was intelligence, sometimes it was courage that bordered on disbelief, and sometimes it was a level of professionalism that made everyone around them better. I was fortunate enough to race in an era filled with extraordinary men. Some were world champions, some became legends long before they retired. Others left us far too soon, but their influence never disappeared. Every one of them taught me something that no engineer, team manager, or driving instructor ever could. There are 5 names that always come back to me whenever I think about the drivers I admired most. Some of them probably won't surprise you, others just might. But each one earned my respect for a very different reason, and every time I shared a circuit with them, I came away understanding Formula One a little better. Let me start with Alain Prost, because he completely changed the way I looked at what it meant to be fast. When people talk about Prost, they usually begin with 4 world championships. That's understandable. But those titles never explained why so many drivers respected him as much as they did. The real story was hidden inside the way he approached every lap, every decision, and every race weekend. The first thing that struck me about Alain was how calm he always seemed. Formula One paddocks in the 1980s were full of emotion. Drivers got frustrated, teams panicked, pressure built quickly, especially on race weekends when championships were on the line. Somehow, Prost rarely looked rushed. He had this remarkable ability to slow everything down in his own mind while everyone else felt like they were running out of time. People often called him the professor, and it wasn't just because he was intelligent. He understood that winning a Grand Prix started long before the lights went out. He listened to engineers. He studied tire wear. He thought about fuel consumption. He knew exactly when to attack and exactly when to wait. Watching him was like watching someone play chess while the rest of us were playing a much faster game. I remember looking across the timing screens during the mid-1980s and realizing that Alain didn't always dominate practice sessions. Sometimes another driver would top the charts on Friday, and the headlines would immediately focus on raw speed. But by Sunday afternoon, Prost somehow found himself in exactly the right position. That wasn't luck. It was preparation, patience, and an understanding of racing that very few people possessed. The 1986 season probably explains him better than almost any other. Williams had arguably the strongest car that year, with Nigel Mansell and Nelson Piquet. Most people expected one of them to win the championship comfortably. Instead, Prost stayed close all season, scoring points whenever opportunities appeared and refusing to make mistakes under pressure. Then came Adelaide. Mansell suffered the famous tire failure. Piquet had to pit as a precaution. Prost kept his McLaren on track, avoided unnecessary risks, and drove away with the World Championship. From the outside, people saw fortune. Those of us inside Formula One saw something different. Alain had spent an entire season putting himself in position to capitalize if the smallest opportunity appeared. That was what I admired most. He never raced to impress anyone. He raced to maximize every possible result. There were drivers who could produce a more spectacular qualifying lap or a more dramatic overtaking move. Prost didn't care about being spectacular. He cared about winning on Sunday afternoon. Racing against Alain taught me that Formula One isn't simply a contest of bravery or natural talent. Intelligence can be every bit as decisive as courage. A driver who understands the race better than everyone else often doesn't need to be the fastest driver on the circuit. Even now, when I think about Alain Prost, I don't remember the celebrations or the trophies first. I remember the quiet confidence. I remember the patience. And I remember realizing that some drivers beat you long before either of you reached the first corner. Now, this is a completely different kind of admiration. Gilles Villeneuve didn't make me rethink racing because of careful strategy or relentless consistency. He made me rethink what courage looked like inside a Formula One car. To this day, I'm not sure I've ever seen another driver who attacked every lap with the same absolute commitment. When I first watched Gilles up close, it felt like he was operating under a different set of rules. Most of us knew where the limit was. We spent our careers trying to stay as close to it as possible without crossing it. Gilles seemed to treat the limit as nothing more than a suggestion. He drove with an intensity that was impossible to ignore, and somehow he could make a car dance even when it looked completely unsettled. What impressed me wasn't reckless driving. That's a misconception people often have. Gilles wasn't fast because he ignored danger. He was fast because he trusted his instincts more than almost anyone I've ever known. He could catch a sliding car before most drivers even realized they had lost it. He was constantly balancing the Ferrari on the edge, and somehow it often worked. The race that always comes back to me is the 1981 Spanish Grand Prix at Jarama. The Ferrari wasn't considered the quickest car that weekend, yet Gilles produced one of the greatest defensive drives Formula One has ever seen. For lap after lap, he kept a train of significantly faster cars behind him. Jacques Laffite, John Watson, Carlos Reutemann, Elio De Angelis, and others all searched for a way past, but nobody found one. The top 5 crossed the finish line separated by barely more than a second. Watching that performance reminded everyone that racecraft isn't always about outright speed. Sometimes it's about absolute precision under relentless pressure. Then, of course, came 1982. The atmosphere inside Formula One changed forever after Zolder. Gilles lost his life during qualifying for the Belgian Grand Prix, and the entire paddock felt different afterward. Rivalries suddenly seemed less important. Arguments disappeared. Every driver understood how fragile this profession really was. We all accepted the risks when we climbed into those cars, but moments like that forced us to confront what those risks actually meant. His career was painfully short, yet his influence reached far beyond the statistics. He won only 6 Grand Prix, but almost nobody who raced against him judged him by numbers. We remembered the commitment, the spectacular recoveries, the impossible overtakes, and the feeling that every single lap mattered to him. Gilles taught me something that no championship table ever could. Talent means very little without the willingness to commit completely when the moment arrives. He raced with his whole heart every single weekend, and that honesty earned the respect of everyone who shared the circuit with him. Even now, when people ask me about the bravest driver I ever raced against, I never have to think very long. Gilles Villeneuve showed all of us that some drivers become legends not because of how many races they win, but because of the unforgettable way they choose to race. Then there was Ayrton Senna. If Alain Prost taught me how important intelligence was, Senna reminded me that there are moments in this sport when talent seems to exist on a completely different level. I've raced against many exceptional drivers, but there were weekends when Ayrton made everyone in the paddock feel like we were competing for second place before the race had even begun. The first thing you noticed about Senna wasn't his personality, it was the stopwatch. Formula One has always been brutally honest. It doesn't care about reputations or opinions. It simply measures time. Again and again, especially on Saturdays, Ayrton produced laps that left engineers shaking their heads and experienced drivers searching for explanations. Sometimes the difference wasn't enormous on paper, but everyone knew those few tenths represented something extraordinary. What made him so remarkable wasn't just raw speed. Plenty of drivers were capable of driving quickly over a single lap. Ayrton had an almost supernatural ability to find grip where nobody else believed it existed. He attacked braking zones with absolute conviction, carried astonishing speed through corners, and somehow still managed to place the car exactly where it needed to be. He drove with complete commitment, but it never looked random. Every movement seemed deliberate. Monaco was probably the circuit that revealed his gift more clearly than anywhere else. The streets leave no room for hesitation. Every barrier punishes even the smallest mistake. Yet Senna treated that place almost like it belonged to him. His qualifying performances there became legendary because he wasn't simply beating the field, he was redefining what people believed was physically possible around one of the hardest circuits in the world. I still think about the 1988 Monaco Grand Prix qualifying session. McLaren already had the best car on the grid, but what Ayrton accomplished that afternoon went far beyond machinery. He outqualified Alain Prost by more than a second on the same team, using virtually identical equipment. In Formula One, a tenth of a second can separate several rows of the grid. More than a full second between two drivers of that caliber was almost impossible to comprehend. Years later, Ayrton himself admitted he felt as though he had entered a different state of concentration, driving almost instinctively rather than consciously. Whether you believe that description or not, everyone watching knew they had witnessed something unique. Of course, there was much more to Senna than qualifying laps. His performances in the rain became part of Formula One folklore because he seemed able to read changing conditions faster than anyone else. While the rest of us searched for grip, Ayrton appeared to know exactly where it would appear before we found it ourselves. Races that became chaotic for everyone else often became opportunities for him to separate himself from the field. Competing against Ayrton taught me a valuable lesson. Sometimes preparation, experience, and confidence still aren't enough when someone discovers another level. The challenge isn't trying to copy them. It's accepting that greatness occasionally arrives in forms you simply have to admire. When I remember Ayrton Senna today, I don't just remember a three-time world champion. I remember the feeling that every qualifying session was capable of producing something none of us had ever seen before. Very few drivers change expectations. Ayrton changed the definition of what a Formula One driver could do behind the wheel. This might surprise some people because I didn't spend years fighting wheel-to-wheel with Niki Lauda the way I did with some others on this list. But admiration isn't measured by how many races you shared. Sometimes it's measured by how much you learned simply by watching someone work. And when it came to professionalism, I honestly don't think anyone set a higher standard than Niki. By the time I arrived in Formula One, Lauda had already lived through experiences that would have ended most careers. The Nürburgring accident in 1976 had become part of the sport's history, but what impressed me wasn't the crash itself. It was everything that came afterward. Most people remember that he returned just 6 weeks later at Monza, still recovering from severe burns. Drivers remembered something else. They remembered a man who refused to let tragedy define the rest of his career. What made Niki so exceptional wasn't spectacular car control or dramatic overtakes. It was the way he removed emotion from decisions that normally overwhelmed everyone else. Formula One is full of pressure. Teams panic when development falls behind. Drivers lose confidence after one bad weekend. Rumors spread through the paddock faster than facts. Somehow Lauda always seemed capable of separating emotion from reality. You could see it in the way he worked with engineers. While many drivers described a car by saying it felt good or bad, Niki explained exactly what the car was doing and exactly how it could be improved. Every test session had a purpose. Every lap produced information. Engineers loved working with him because he didn't waste their time. He wasn't trying to sound impressive, he was trying to make the car faster. His return with McLaren proved that his greatest strength had never been natural speed alone. After retiring at the end of 1979, very few people believed he would ever compete for another championship. Yet when he came back in 1982, he quickly reminded everyone why he had already become a legend. 2 years later came one of the closest championship battles Formula One has ever seen. The 1984 season perfectly captured who Niki Lauda really was. His teammate Alain Prost probably had more outright speed over the course of the year. Prost won 7 races, Lauda won 5. But Niki understood that championships are decided over an entire season, not just on Sunday afternoons. He scored consistently, avoided costly mistakes, and managed every opportunity with remarkable discipline. When the season ended, he defeated Prost by just half a point. Still the closest championship margin in Formula One history. That wasn't luck. It was a masterclass in precision and consistency. Watching Lauda taught me that being a complete Formula One driver meant much more than driving talent. It meant understanding people, understanding machinery, and understanding yourself. He never seemed interested in proving he was fearless. He was interested in making the smartest possible decision, even when everyone else expected something more dramatic. That's probably why I've always admired him so much. Niki Lauda showed that intelligence isn't the opposite of bravery. Sometimes it's the highest form of bravery. Even decades later, I still think every young driver could learn something from the way he approached this sport, because Formula One has changed enormously since his era, but true professionalism never goes out of style. And then came Michael Schumacher. By the time Michael arrived in Formula One, it was obvious that the sport was beginning to change. We had seen brilliant drivers before, we had seen fearless drivers before. What we hadn't seen was someone who combined talent, preparation, fitness, technical understanding, and relentless determination quite the way Michael did. Looking back now, I think he represented the beginning of the modern Formula One driver. I first realized how different he was during his early years with Benetton. He wasn't intimidated by reputation. It didn't matter whether he was racing against established world champions or veterans with hundreds of Grand Prix behind them. Michael approached every weekend with the same confidence, as though he belonged at the front from the moment he entered Formula One. What impressed me most wasn't simply his speed. It was the amount of work happening behind the scenes. Michael spent endless hours with engineers, analyzing data, discussing setup changes, and searching for tiny improvements that most drivers might never notice. He understood that championships weren't won only on Sundays. They were built during test sessions, factory meetings, simulator work, and conversations that nobody outside the team ever saw. The 1992 Belgian Grand Prix at Spa was an early glimpse of what was coming. Schumacher claimed his first Formula One victory that afternoon, but it wasn't just another young driver earning a breakthrough win. Changing weather conditions made tire strategy incredibly difficult, and Michael recognized before almost anyone else that slick tires would become the faster option as the circuit dried. That decision helped transform the race and announced that Formula One had a future champion on its hands. It wasn't only bravery or pace, it was judgment under pressure. As the years passed, his influence became even greater. When he joined Ferrari in 1996, many people questioned whether anyone could bring the team back to the top after years of frustration. Michael never seemed interested in shortcuts. Instead, he helped build an entire culture around preparation, accountability, and continuous improvement. Alongside Jean Todt, Ross Brawn, Rory Byrne, and an extraordinary group of engineers and mechanics, he turned Ferrari into the dominant force of the early 2000s. Watching that transformation from the outside was every bit as impressive as watching him drive. He also changed the physical demands of Formula One. Before Michael, fitness certainly mattered, but he elevated it to another level. Suddenly being exceptionally talented wasn't enough. Drivers had to train harder, recover better, and prepare more professionally, because Schumacher had raised the standard for everyone. The generation that followed didn't simply compete against Michael. They adapted to the benchmark he created. That's why I've always admired him so deeply. Michael Schumacher didn't just win races or championships. He changed expectations across the entire sport. He proved that excellence wasn't one extraordinary qualifying lap or one unforgettable Sunday. Excellence was showing up every single day with the same commitment to becoming better than you were yesterday. When I think about Michael now, I don't just remember a 7-time world champion. I remember the driver who convinced Formula One that the future belonged to those willing to outwork everyone else. That's a lesson that has never stopped being relevant. Looking back now, I realize this list was never really about choosing the 5 greatest drivers. Formula One has always been too rich, too competitive, and too unpredictable for something that simple. It was about the 5 men who left the deepest impression on me, each in a completely different way. Alain Prost showed me that intelligence could win races just as surely as raw speed. Gilles Villeneuve reminded me that courage can inspire an entire generation even without a long list of victories. Ayrton Senna proved there are moments when human ability seems to reach beyond what the rest of us think is possible. Niki Lauda demonstrated that discipline and professionalism can overcome almost anything life puts in your way. And Michael Schumacher showed all of us that greatness isn't built on talent alone. It's built on relentless commitment every single day. If I had the chance to climb back into one of those Formula One cars and race that era all over again, I wouldn't change a thing. Of course, there are races I'd love to run differently and opportunities I'd like to have back. Every driver has those memories, but I wouldn't trade the privilege of competing against men like these for anything. That's the beautiful thing about Formula One. The trophies eventually gather dust. The statistics become history. But the drivers who challenge the way you think about racing stay with you forever. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can still hear those engines, still see those helmets disappearing into the first corner, and still feel grateful that for a little while, I shared the track with some of the finest racing drivers the world has ever known.